History has seen some truly amazing, but also some very tragic events, many of which made their way into textbooks, documentaries, and movies that we can watch and read about today. But there are some bizarre and unsettling events that have also played a part in shaping our history, despite the fact that they aren't as well known. Number 10. Fashion has been a talking point throughout pretty much all of human history, as is evidenced by some items of clothing that can be found in ancient tombs and writings that have been uncovered at archaeological sites. One of the most iconic fashion periods in modern times is undoubtedly the 1920s, when the famous designer Coco Chanel had a major impact on what was being worn, including two-tone shoes, tennis-inspired outfits, and many different types of hats that included picture hats, bucket hats, and torque hats, to name but a few. But there are also some fashion ideas that were to be avoided, such as the famous never wear white after Labor Day rule that most people still swear by today. Making such a mistake could open anyone up to ridicule, and hence most people stuck to these rules religiously, especially if they were attending dinners or parties. One such rule caused quite a stir in New York in the 1920s, during a time when wearing straw hats had become popular among men. These hats were referred to as straw boaters, since they were usually worn to sporting events, one of the most popular being boating at the time. But this wasn't always the case. Just a few years prior to the straw hat's popularity, it was considered unacceptable for a man to wear either a straw or Panama hat, but at the turn of the century, things changed. But there was one rule: don't wear a straw hat after the 15th of September, unless you like facing the scornful looks of those around you. This rule was so steadfast that newspapers would often print articles in which they reminded men that it was time to pack these hats away for the year. This gave young men in the city the perfect excuse to act out when they saw someone breaking this rule, as it had become tradition for them to knock the hat off of anyone's head who was seen wearing one after that specific date. But on the 13th of September, 1922, 2 days before the dreaded deadline, one group of boys was a little too eager to get the game underway, and it had some unexpected consequences. On that day, a group of factory workers in Manhattan, who were wearing their straw hats, were set upon by these youths who knocked the hats off their heads and proceeded to stomp on them with delight. This obviously infuriated the workers, who would have used their hard-earned cash to acquire the hats, and hence they retaliated. A fight broke out between the youths and the factory workers that at one point got so bad that it halted traffic on the Manhattan Bridge. The game then spread to other areas of the city, with as many as 1,000 people fighting and arguing about the hats on Amsterdam Avenue. On Christopher Street, the youths took to pulling hats off the heads of men riding in surface cars or streetcars as they went by. And before long, a full-blown riot had broken out in the city, with police officers scrambling to restore peace. The following evening, still 1 day before the official fashion deadline, hundreds of young men armed with sticks to which they had wires attached hid all over the city and used the sticks to yank the straw hats away from the unsuspecting victims. They then kept the hats as trophies, with one reporter stating that he saw a few of these youths with as many as 30 hats that they had collected. But not all of the targets were as easy to get one over on. Another group that was accosted was made up of dock workers who retaliated, and a massive brawl broke out that was only contained after the police intervened. Hat shops in the city made a good amount of money during this time, as they stayed open late in case someone had their hat snatched or stomped on, and they needed to buy another, more fashionably acceptable one. At first, police officers didn't take these incidents too seriously, until several off-duty officers had their hats snatched and were caught up in the ensuing brawls that were breaking out all over the city. Many of the boys were arrested and had their parents summoned to the police station for them to be got and punished. Those who were old enough had to appear in court for their mischief, with some receiving fines of up to £5, or in some more severe cases, a short stint in jail, with one offender being sentenced to several days behind bars. These types of incidents would occur again over the next 2 years, not only in New York, but also in other cities. But the trend would eventually die out when the straw hats were no longer fashionable, and eventually most men stopped wearing hats, leaving the straw hat riots of 1922 as nothing more than a distant memory. Number 9. Nicola Tesla is hailed as one of the greatest scientific minds history has ever seen. as he's credited with inventing not only the Tesla coil, probably his most famous invention, but also the remote control, induction motor, neon lamp, and hydroelectricity, as well as many others. But not many people know that he was somewhat of a strange character, who had some very strange quirks. He had a strange obsession with pigeons, and he would regularly be seen feeding them in parks in New York where he lived. When he came across a pigeon that had been injured, he would pick it up and bring it to his hotel room in which he lived, where he would then nurse it back to health. He would also leave his room window open, allowing pigeons to fly in at will and resulting in a rather unsightly mess. Those who knew Tesla well found this obsession strange, since he was known to have a phobia of germs, which these birds had in abundance. He even admitted on one occasion to falling in love with one specific white pigeon, stating that as long as it visited him regularly, he felt that his life had a purpose. But in 1922, the same pigeon visited his room again, and he would later state that it told him that it was about to pass away. When it did so, he saw a light shining from its eyes, and he would later tell his friends that at that moment, it felt as though his life's work was done. But this wasn't the only strange trait that the scientist had. He also had a strange obsession with the number 3. He would often be seen walking around a building 3 times before he dared to enter it, and he usually washed his hands 3 times whenever he needed to do so. But his strangeness didn't end there. He also had an aversion to pearls to the point where he would refuse to talk to any woman who was wearing them. On one occasion, his secretary arrived for work wearing a string of pearls, and he immediately sent her home for the rest of the day. Many of Tesla's inventions center around the use of electricity, something that most people at that time would have considered too dangerous to work with. But his mother believed that he became obsessed with electricity when he was just 3 years old, due to the fact that he was born during a thunderstorm. He also recounted on many occasions that he had had blindingly bright flashes of light appear before his eyes, and during some of these events, those flashes would contain images of items that he would later go on to invent. It would later be speculated that these flashes were the result of his mental illness, though it's hard to argue that they didn't turn him into a visionary of his times. As for his diet, he was of the opinion that people wouldn't keep eating meat for very long, and so he resorted to eating only honey, milk, bread, and juiced vegetables. One of his most outlandish claims came in 1901, when he stated that he had been contacted by extraterrestrial beings. He claimed to have received strange radio signals 2 years prior to this revelation, and since that time, he had increasingly felt that he was the first ever human to have heard an interplanetary greeting. Tesla also never got married, and many people thought that he had no interest whatsoever in women, until he eventually explained that he felt he was unworthy of their attention. Not only that, but he felt that it would be a distraction to his work, on one occasion stating, quote, "I don't think you can name many great inventions that have been made by married men." As time went on, Tesla became ever more reclusive as he withdrew from the public eye. But given his genius, people were always interested in what he was working on. And so he took to holding a press conference on his birthday every year, thereby ensuring that people would leave him alone until his next birthday. He would eventually pass away in 1943 due to coronary problems, and as soon as this happened, the FBI raided his hotel room and confiscated all of the work and papers that he'd been working on. Many of these papers have since been released to the public, but there are still many that are considered classified, and one can only wonder what these ideas and inventions were that made them so important to the US government. Number 8. Christmas season is hailed by many as their favorite time of year. Most of us get some well-earned time off of work, and we get to spend quality time with our friends and family. Though many people see it as a religious holiday, others consider it to just be a relaxing time of the year when they can unwind before returning to the hustle and bustle of everyday life the following year. Then there's the food. Different cultures around the world have different Christmas menus, but no matter where you are in the world, there's usually a lot to eat, and many people to share it with. This is the way we see Christmas in modern times, but the sad reality is that it wasn't always the case, most notably in the 1640s, when the Puritans, or English Protestants, decided that Christmas should be outlawed. They felt that Christmas was an invention of the pagans and Romans, specifically the Roman Catholic Church. And since the Puritans didn't agree with the way Roman Catholics approached Christianity, they felt that their tradition of celebrating the holiday was unacceptable. They also noted that Christmas Day isn't mentioned anywhere in the Bible, And to strengthen their case, they added that celebrations on the day had become ever more debauched, with people drinking excessively and behaving in a manner that was not considered Christian. The Puritans proceeded to appeal to Parliament, and on the 8th of June, 1642, a bill was passed that abolished the holiday altogether. Stores were not allowed to be closed on the 25th of December. Children were forced to attend school like a normal day, and it was against the law to eat any traditional Christmas foods. If any of these rules were broken, arrests would be made that often resulted in jail time. In London, town criers could be heard yelling, "No Christmas," and police officers patrolled the streets, confiscating anything and everything they deemed to be too Christmassy. It was even against the law to wish someone a Merry Christmas. It was even illegal for clergymen to perform Christmas Day sermons, lest they wanted to be arrested. Instead, people were encouraged to spend the day fasting and praying, and in some areas such as England, this became a tradition that was observed every Wednesday. In 1647, the bill was taken a step further, when Parliament announced that Easter and the Pentecost would also be outlawed. People were not even allowed to celebrate these days in their own homes, and if they were found to be in violation, they would be hit with stiff fines. But the new laws did not sit well with members of the public, some of whom became defiant at the news, and before long, riots broke out in Ipswich and Canterbury. In London, people protested by ignoring the ban, and they started decorating buildings with rosemary and bay plants. When a group of people were found to be decorating a pump in the city center, police officers were dispatched to remove them, but they were confronted by members of the public and chased through the streets under threats of violence. The ban was still in place in 1656, 12 years after it had been imposed. But many people had, by this point, decided that they'd had enough, and they simply ignored the laws, celebrating their beloved holiday all the same. Shops in London closed up for the day, and many people held Christmas lunches that were attended by family and friends, much to the dismay of the MPs who reported that they'd been kept awake by these celebrations. These rules eventually became completely ungovernable, and in 1660, the ban was finally lifted, but it would remain intact in New England for a further 21 years. Many people have attributed the ban to Oliver Cromwell, since it's believed that he was responsible specifically for a ban on mince pies. But this is a misconception, as it's since been found that he had very little to do with the ban. Though Cromwell was a Puritan, it's now believed that he had little interest in the Christmas ban since he had bigger things to worry about, such as the First English Civil War, which raged from 1642 to 1646. It's said that he certainly supported the ban since he never took any action to have it repealed, but he also never did anything to enforce it, and hence it's likely that he didn't give it much thought. Whatever the case may be, we can thank our lucky stars that we're able to celebrate Christmas today, since it was a very different scenario a few centuries ago. Number 7. It's hard to imagine living in a society where we aren't able to express ourselves as freely as we do today. But the sad reality is that there have been such times all throughout history, as people have tried to suppress each other's beliefs for centuries. In modern times, we have a much better understanding of freedom of speech. And in most developed countries, we're free to believe what we want without the fear of persecution. Though this wasn't always the case, as is evidenced by a trial that took place in 1925 in Tennessee. The trial, known as the Scopes Monkey Trial, involved a high school teacher named John Thomas Scopes, who had violated Tennessee law by teaching evolution rather than creationism, which states that humans were created as is listed in the Bible by the hand of God. When Scopes was found to be in violation of the Butler Act, the law had only been in existence for a few months since it was passed in March of that year. It stated that a person would be charged with a misdemeanor if they were found to be teaching, quote, any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. Unbeknownst to the prosecution in the case, Scopes hadn't accidentally been caught, but had in fact conspired with a man named George Rapallia, who purposefully got caught so that the issue could be properly hashed out in court. Once he was placed in custody for his violation, he and Rapallia acquired the services of the American Civil Liberties Union, which acted as the defense during his trial. This drew the ire of William Jennings Bryan, a fundamentalist and previous presidential candidate, who then stood with the prosecution. But the defense enlisted the help of Clarence Darrow, a well-known and experienced attorney, and before long, the entire country waited with bated breath for the trial to begin in earnest. This wasn't the first time that Brian and Darrow had been at loggerheads over evolution and the Bible, as they debated this topic in public on many occasions, and had even argued against each other in the press on occasion. This trial would be no different, as the two men immediately started slinging mud at each other via the press. Brian attempted to have Darrow removed from the trial, but he was unsuccessful, and on the 9th of May, 1925, the jury assembled for the first time. Scopes had concocted a plan in which he convinced 7 of his students to testify against him, and when 3 of the 7 were called to the stand, they clearly had a very limited understanding of evolution, which resulted in the trial being brought forward to the 10th of July. When Brian arrived in Dayton in advance of the trial on the 7th of July, he was met by hundreds of people as he stepped off his train. People took photos with him, and he took the opportunity to deliver a few speeches ahead of the trial, in which he vowed to debunk evolution altogether. On the day of the trial, hundreds of people showed up at the courthouse, and soon they were having barbecues outside. Carnival games had been set up, and concession stands were making a lot of money. When the trial finally began, the prosecution called witnesses who stated that they saw Scopes teaching evolution in his classroom. A zoologist was called to explain the science behind the theory of evolution, and when Brian was finally called to the stand, he was forced to admit that he had a very limited knowledge of science, since the Bible didn't offer any explanation on the subject. The judge eventually decided that Brian's testimony should be stricken from the record, since he felt that it served no purpose in the trial. In a surprise move, Darrow then asked the judge to find Scopes, his client, guilty of the offense, since it would allow him to appeal the verdict later in a higher court. His recommendation was accepted, and after just 9 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. He was ordered to pay a fine of $100, which was eventually paid by Brian and the American Civil Liberties Union. But Scopes vowed to keep teaching evolution, since he believed that not doing so would violate his academic freedom. He would appeal the sentence in January of 1927, and this time the Butler Act was found to be unconstitutional, but it wouldn't be until 1967 that the act was repealed in Tennessee. It was the first trial in American history to be broadcast on the radio, and it took the world by storm, with reporters as far afield as Hong Kong and England attending the proceedings, which centered on a topic that is still hotly debated today. Number 6. If you were asked to associate an alcoholic drink with Russia, the chances are very high that you would opt for vodka, since it's known to be the most popular drink in the country, despite many people claiming that it was actually invented in Poland in the 8th or 9th century. The beverage is consumed at all kinds of events, not only celebrations, and it wouldn't be a reach to say that most Russian households have at least one bottle of vodka sitting in the cupboard. But one occasion saw more vodka being consumed than ever before, and with good reason. On the 9th of May, 1945, an announcement was made over the radio at 1:10 a.m. that sent the country into a frenzy of celebration. News had broken that Germany had finally decided to surrender, and the Second World War had finally come to an end, bringing many years of hardship and fighting to a long overdue end. As one would imagine, this gave rise to much jubilation, and in no time at all, people took to the streets to celebrate with none other than their favorite beverage, vodka. While some celebrated, others mourned the loss of their friends and family members during the conflict. But either way, vodka was the drink of choice. People were seen walking through the streets still dressed in their pajamas, hugging each other and weeping with joy or regret at the great losses that they all suffered. It's said that even teetotalers joined in the festivities, drinking vodka with their fellow revelers, when they usually never touched alcohol at all. While the war was ongoing, people only had a limited supply of vodka, and since the conflict had come to an end, they now felt free to indulge to their heart's desire. In just 22 hours after the end of the war was announced, Joseph Stalin was set to address the nation. But quite unbelievably, by this time, there was no vodka left in the entire country. During wartime, grain reserves had dwindled, and since it was one of the main ingredients in vodka, its production had slowed to a crawl, but there was still plenty to go around before the festivities began. This is due to the fact that Stalin had ordered vodka production to continue during the war, since it accounted for about 20% of the country's government revenue during that time. In fact, its production had been made a priority, and while it wasn't as freely available as it normally would have been, there wasn't a shortage during the celebrations. That is, until the next day, when the entire country is said to have been suffering from a hangover. One reporter who arrived in Moscow on the 10th of May stated that he was lucky to happen upon a liter of vodka, since there was none to be purchased in any stores. One man who was present at the time recounted the festivities of his family later on, and he stated that this was the only occasion in his entire life that he lost consciousness due to drinking. He would later wake up the following morning and realize he was lying in the street, clutching 2 loaves of bread that he had bought. It could only have come as a great relief to the people of Russia when it was announced that the war had come to an end. Before this happened, many people decided to produce their own vodka, often with disastrous results, since not everyone was familiar with the exact science. Many people stated after the fact that they had little memory of that night, and that they had to rely on others to recount what had happened during the celebrations. Needless to say, if there was ever one occasion where it would be completely acceptable for a nation to drain its own vodka reserves, it would be thanks to hearing the news that the Second World War had finally come to an end. Number 5. Most of us are familiar with Freemasonry, but not many are aware of an offshoot of the order, which, when translated to English, means the Order of the Pug. When the order was founded in 1717, they were known to be a secret society that held ceremonies behind closed doors. They also didn't just let anyone join their brotherhood, as they had a strict view of who should be allowed in. But the Catholic Church was less than impressed with the newly established group, since their ideologies didn't center around religion as most others did. So anyone affiliated with the Catholic Church was prohibited from joining the Freemasons, as per the orders of Pope Clement XII in 1738. This prompted a man by the name of Clemens August to take action, and he decided to start a branch of the Freemasons in Germany, but with a few changes that would incorporate the Pope's ban. And so the Order of the Pug was born. Members had to display the same characteristics that a pug dog did, including being loyal, trustworthy, and having an unshakable character. But these weren't the only criteria for application to the group. Potential members had to don a dog collar and get down on their hands and knees, after which they had to scratch at the group's door in hopes that they would be accepted and let in. If this was done, the rest of the group would bark at their new member, and they would then kiss a porcelain figure of a pug dog for the ceremony to be complete. The group's leader was called the Grand Mops, or the Grand Pug, who led their strange ceremonies, and at his table was placed a sword as well as a toilet. The sword harkened back to the Freemasons, who regularly used these weapons in their ceremonies, but no one seems to be quite sure why a toilet had to be present. Another difference between the Freemasons and the Order of the Pug was that the latter group allowed women to join their order, and where the Freemasons only referred to their members as brothers, the Pugs had both brothers and sisters. When they were in the midst of one of their ceremonies, they would be seated in alternating order, a man then a woman, and so on until all the seats had been filled. This was also done by order of the rank that each person in the group had achieved. When the ceremony was over, the group always ended the night by pledging that they would never reveal any of the order's secrets, nor verbally, nor by sign, nor by writing. It's interesting to note that many of the practices described here were written down by a Catholic abbot, and since he wasn't part of the order, someone from the Pugs must have reneged on their vow of secrecy. In 1745, a book was published called The Order of Freemasons Betrayed and the Secrets of the Pug Revealed, which hailed the last days of the order since their secrets had been exposed. Not only were they no longer permitted to gather, but they also faced punishment from the Catholic Church, and specifically the Pope himself. It isn't immediately clear why the group was forced to disband, but it's been suggested that it was either due to their strange and outlandish traditions and ceremonies, or because the Catholic Church felt that they had, in a sense, gone rogue. Whatever the case may be, it made little difference as members of the public were outraged when they read the revelations about what had been going on behind the order's closed doors. Though Freemasonry was perfectly acceptable, the Catholic Church took a stance against anything that was done in secret, despite not being the most transparent in their own right. It's also been suggested that what the book claimed the order got up to wasn't entirely accurate, but since the author was affiliated with the Catholic Church, his writings were accepted as fact by the Church and the public, ensuring that the Order of the Pug was well and truly finished. It's said that not the entire order fell at this point though, as there were rumors that some of their members continued their strange practices for another 257 years until 1902, though this is mere speculation. Though the Order of the Pug no longer exists, they've been depicted in many paintings, sculptures, and books, so their legacy still lives on today, if only as a footnote in the history of the Freemasons. Number 4. Anyone who has fought in a war or lived in a war-torn country will attest to the fact that it's like living through a waking nightmare, during which they not only do their best to survive through each day, but sometimes for years on end, as some wars lasted much longer than anyone expected. Some examples of this are the Moroccan-Portuguese conflicts that were fought between 1415 and 1769, a staggering 354 years. This war was started by the Portuguese, who wanted to ensure that they gained control over Morocco, and in doing so, remained the superior naval force in the Western Mediterranean Sea. The Byzantine-Bulgarian Wars lasted even longer, as they were fought between the years 680 and 1355, a total of 675 years. At one point, peace treaties were signed, and for some time there was peace between the Eastern Roman Empire and Bulgaria. But this came to an end when Tsar Simeon and Tsar Ivan Alexander came into power, as they sought to expand their empire deeper into Eastern Roman Empire territory. Then there was the Reconquista, which lasted as many as 781 years. This war was fought between the combined forces of Spain and Portugal against the Iberian Peninsula's Muslim leaders. The war was initiated by an Islamic Berber army in the year 711, and when all was said and done, at the end of the conflict, it would mark the beginning of the Renaissance. Given the lengths of these wars, the loss of life must have been immense, since battles were fought in many different areas over an unbelievably extended period of time. But not all centuries-long wars were as destructive, as is evidenced by the Dutch Scilly War, which lasted 335 years. The conflict in question here was between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly, which is a small archipelago that lies off the southwestern coast of England. It's said that although the war was ongoing, it received so little attention that most of the inhabitants of the Scilly Isles had no idea that they were in the middle of a war. The conflict has its roots in the English Civil War, which lasted from 1642 to 1651. As the war started to draw to a close, it became obvious that Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarians would emerge victorious. And so the Netherlands decided to ally with them in order to ensure that they would have good relations with the war's victors. This understandably drew the ire of King Charles I's royalists, who considered the Dutch to be traitors, and they resorted to attacking Dutch merchant ships that were sailing through the English Channel. But this was done in vain, as the parliamentarians were on the verge of victory, and the remaining members of the royalist navy were forced to flee to the Isles of Scilly. This gave ships from the Netherlands the perfect opportunity to enact revenge upon the navy, and they created a blockade with 12 of their ships around the Isles. They demanded that the royalist navy repay them for the damages they had incurred, but they had no intention of doing so, since they were already used to holding out against all odds. Noting the navy's defiance, Dutch Admiral Martin Tromp decided to declare war on the Isles. It may seem illogical to declare war on the Isles rather than against the Royalist Navy, but there were no longer any territories being held by the Royalists in England, so there was no other area to declare war against. The stalemate lasted for a few months without a single shot being fired, and in the end the Royalists surrendered, bringing the English Civil War to an end, and the Isles now belonged to the parliamentarians. The blockade was ordered to leave, and Admiral Tromp left the area with his men. But they neglected to sign a peace treaty with the Isles, and hence they were technically still at war, though no one seemed to take any notice of this. The two sides would technically remain at war with each other for the next 335 years, until someone finally realized that the war had never been officially called off. A historian from the Isles of Scilly finally discovered the oversight and brought it to the attention of the Dutch government, who then sent an ambassador to the Isles to sort out the issue in 1986. Here, he and the representatives of the islands officially signed a peace treaty, and the war had finally come to an end. No shots were ever fired, no lives were lost, and it's sure to go down in history not only as one of the longest, but also one of the least gruesome wars ever fought. But there are some historians who claim that the war never really started, since Admiral Tromp didn't have the authority to declare war on anyone without the Dutch government's say-so. Whatever the case may be, most people maintain that it was an official war, despite the fact that it never saw any conflicts. Number 3. One would think if we lived during the Great Depression era, the last thing on our minds would be to go out dancing, since many people at the time were starving and had to find ways to look after their loved ones. But strangely, many people managed to survive through that era by doing just that, dancing. But it all started roughly a decade earlier, during the 1920s, when the First World War had just ended a few years earlier, and people were starting to see a renewed sense of normality. With this came the need for entertainment, and before long, theaters, amusement parks, and most importantly, dance halls were appearing all over America. Couples would attend these halls regularly, and soon enough it had grown into a full-blown craze. But this wasn't the only thing that Americans were obsessed with at the time. The Olympic Games were also at the forefront of people's minds, as they had seen all kinds of world records being broken, and in 1923, a dance instructor named Alma Cummings decided that she would make an attempt at a record of her own in Manhattan. She managed to dance uninterrupted for an unbelievable 27 hours, inspiring many other people to try and break her record as quickly as possible. It would stand for just 3 weeks until it was broken 9 times by different people all across the country. And so dance marathons had become the new craze of the time. As with any form of entertainment, there's always some money to be made. And as soon as promoters caught wind of these marathons, they leaped at the opportunity to turn a profit. They offered cash prizes to the winners of these dance marathons. And given that most people were struggling to put food on the table, there was no shortage of contestants. Live bands were hired to play at these events, but they lasted so long that phonograph records had to be played in their absence. To ensure that there was no cheating, a set of rules was published and had to be followed to the letter if the cash prize was to be won. Dancers had to stay in motion for the entire duration of the marathon, or they would promptly be disqualified, thereby losing their chance at the grand prize. For every hour of dancing, there would be a respite of 15 minutes, during which the dancers could receive medical treatment if needed. Promoters also made sure to provide the contestants with several meals a day, and most of the dancers opted to eat these while they were still dancing. They were also seen to shave, read, and even take baths while the contest was ongoing, which was perfectly acceptable as long as they remained in constant motion. Another rule was set in place that if a contestant could no longer stand, they would be disqualified as soon as their knees touched the ground. So many participants were held up by others to ensure that they remained in the running for the prize. If any of the dancers wanted to step outside during their 15-minute break, they had to be accompanied by one of the promoters to ensure that they didn't do anything that could be seen as against the rules. These events were heavily attended by spectators who were charged a small entrance fee to watch the spectacle. And since these marathons often lasted for days on end, there was quite a bit of money to be made. These contests not only provided poor families with some entertainment, but allowed the winners to care for their families, if only for a short while. In 1929, the craze became even more popular when the stock market crashed. Some impressive records were achieved, one of the most notable occurring in 1928, when a man named Callum de Villiers managed to dance himself to victory with an unbelievable 443 hours of marathon dancing. He would then travel to Somerville in Boston in 1932, where he and his landlord's daughter, Vani Kuczynski, danced from December through to June of the following year, resulting in them receiving a cash prize of $1,000. Soon enough, the economy started to recover, and when World War II loomed over the horizon, dance marathons were the last thing on people's minds, as they started going back to work and quickly started to die out. De Villiers would eventually pass away in 1973, but his legacy remains intact as his headstone reads World Champion Marathon Dancer, 3,780 continuous hours. Number 2. Reconnaissance is a vital part of any war, as it could make the difference between victory and defeat. Many battles have been won or lost due to poor planning, especially when the terrain on which the battle was to be fought was not properly surveyed. This could result in soldiers being ill-prepared for muddy terrain, steep hills, or even a lack of cover, and hence most battles are preceded by reconnaissance missions in a bid to get the upper hand on opposing forces. But when a war is fought across the oceans, this isn't always possible, since coastlines are usually very well defended. In modern times, this problem can be nullified with technology such as unmanned aircraft or drones. But during World War II, these technologies were still a long way off. Probably the most famous battle of this war was D-Day, also known as Operation Neptune, as it's hailed as the largest seaborne invasion in all of history, fought by soldiers from many countries around the world, including Australia, Norway, Poland, Belgium, Greece, France, and the Netherlands, to name but a few. For this invasion to be as successful as it was, a lot of planning had to be done. But this would not be an easy task, since it had to be determined where the best place would be for troops to make their landing on one of Europe's coastlines. Since reconnaissance via the air was pretty much impossible, those fighting against German forces had to come up with a plan, since they didn't want to send soldiers into areas where they had no chance of survival. This is when Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan devised a cunning plan to gain a view of as many of Europe's coastlines as possible, without further endangering the lives of their troops. In 1942, Admiral John Godfrey, the director of British Naval Intelligence, made an announcement on BBC Radio, in which he urged members of the British public to send in any postcards, hotel brochures, guidebooks, or letters that they'd collected while on holiday on the continent in the past. His request was hugely successful, as people started sending these items by the thousands, and by the following year, the War Office had received as many as 10 million submissions that were then closely scrutinized for a strategic landing point. Those photos and postcards that were deemed the most helpful were pinned to a board in the war room, where a type of reconnaissance could be carried out without enemy forces being any the wiser. These efforts were further bolstered by members of the French resistance, who were creating maps of possible landing areas and areas that were heavily occupied by German troops. These were sent back to the war room via carrier pigeon. Soon enough, the decision was made that Normandy would be the best place to launch the invasion, and on the 6th of June, 1944, more than 150,000 troops would storm its beaches in one of the most famous battles in history. German troops were woefully underprepared for the attack, and were taken completely by surprise. Interestingly, Adolf Hitler didn't learn about the invasion until hours after it was launched, since he'd been asleep. This made a massive difference in this particular battle, since none of his generals were prepared to order reinforcements to Normandy. Without his authorization, and to make matters worse, they dared not wake him up. When he did eventually wake up, Hitler was excited at the news that an invasion had been started, since he was under the impression that it would be an easy victory for the German army. Allied forces also had another piece of good fortune, thanks to the weather forecast for Normandy on the 6th of June. Erwin Rommel, the German commander in Normandy, had learned that bad weather was predicted, and so he was certain that an invasion would not take place. He decided to travel home for his wife's 50th birthday, where he gifted her with a new pair of shoes, and hence he was stuck in Germany when the invasion started. Efforts had also been made to convince German forces that the invasion would actually take place somewhere else. This was done by leaking false information to German troops via double agents, and by creating fake military vehicles that were sent to Kent. This proved to be hugely successful, as many German troops were sent to Calais as reinforcement, and even after the D-Day invasion was over, these troops were ordered to remain where they were for fear of a second invasion. It was a battle that made a massive difference in the war, and as unlikely as it may have seemed at the time, the victory was partly made possible by British citizens, who did nothing more than share their holiday postcards. Number 1. Thanks to modern technology, it's very rare for weather forecasts to be wrong, and we can usually plan our day ahead without unexpectedly being caught in a rainstorm. But it's by no means an exact science. There are still some rare occasions when nature takes us by surprise, since atmospheric conditions can change rapidly without warning, resulting in all kinds of strange weather, such as sudden downpours or violent thunderstorms. But there is one storm that occurs in the same area like clockwork. It's said to be so reliable that you could set your watch to it, though this is likely somewhat of a humorous embellishment. The storm in question is known as Hector the Convector, a collection of clouds that can be seen forming virtually every day at the same time between September and March every year above the Tiwi Islands that are located in the Northern Territories of Australia. These clouds typically result in a large thunderstorm, and it's been hailed as one of the world's most consistent since it appears every afternoon with only the occasional exception. Though locals have probably known about the storm's consistency for a very long time, World War II pilots first noticed it while they were flying in the area, and after realizing that it appeared in the same spot every day at about 3 p.m., it became a navigational beacon for them to follow. The storm is caused by the iconic conical shape of the Tiwi Islands. Sea winds from different areas hit the islands, but thanks to their shape, these winds have nowhere to go but upward, resulting in the massive clouds that can be seen as far away as Darwin, which lies about 62 miles to the south. To give an idea of the cloud size, it can reach up to 12 miles into the sky, and it's said that the thunderstorms that it produces are particularly violent and intense, depending on how many storm cells are formed. Some days, the clouds culminate in one massive storm, while in others, it could be divided into 2 or 3 separate smaller storms. Thanks to Hector's predictability, it's been studied extensively, and hence it's become one of the most famous storms in the world. It's provided meteorologists with valuable data as far as lightning, atmospheric boundaries, the influence of ocean winds on the weather, and outflow boundaries during thunderstorms are concerned. They've also been able to create high-resolution numerical models in which they attempted to recreate the conditions under which Hector appears, and these have been very successful, as they were able to accurately reproduce the results. But this is not the only strange weather phenomenon that occurs in Australia on a regular basis. The Gulf of Carpentaria in northeastern Australia regularly sees a strange cloud formation that's affectionately known as morning glory clouds. These clouds have a cylindrical shape that can be up to a mile wide and have been observed to stretch as far as 60 miles into the distance. They usually stay about 300 feet above the ground and can move at 49 feet per second. They're usually accompanied by wind squalls that gust at around the same speed, though these usually only last for around 5 to 10 minutes. They're also quite consistent, as they're most commonly observed between September and in the middle of November, early in the morning, towards the end of Australia's dry season. It's believed that the first official record of these clouds was made by members of the Royal Australian Air Force in 1942. And since then, this strange phenomenon has been the subject of many studies and published papers. As for Hector the Convector, the storm has gained such a reputation for being punctual that it draws large crowds of tourists on a daily basis, and there's no doubt that it's been the subject of hundreds of thousands of photos. But Hector isn't just a source of entertainment, as it can also be very dangerous. The nearby airport sees around 80 inches of rain each year thanks to the storm, and surrounding areas have also been seen flooding in the past due to extensive downpours. The storm has been a reliable source for studies regarding the movement of air and the interaction between air gusts in the upper atmosphere for many years, and hence is seen as somewhat of a mascot among meteorologists. Hector the Convector has probably been around for much longer than we realize, and chances are that it'll continue to appear consistently for a very long time to come. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.